1337, the world of Europa Universalis 5 has a lot of very interesting starting nations, and we're going to be going through them today, beginning with the more obvious ones like the French and the English and working our way to the more obscure start. Not only that, but we're also going to be giving a historical background to all of these nations. As mentioned earlier, the first on this list is going to be the French, together with the English. The 100 Years' War started in May 1337, which is why kind of pepega that we have the 100 Years' War in January 1337 and this mod timeline expanded, so that's not accurate, is it now? The origins of the 100 Years' War are with the claims of Edward III to the throne of the French crown via his mother, which was the daughter of the previous king, Philip IV de Valois. Currently, Philip VI is in charge of the French, and the two relatives having a little bit of a family affair that lasted until 1453. That is 116 years, which begs the question, why is this called the 100 Years' War, not the 116 War? Because everybody likes round numbers. You be quiet right now, you freaking nerd. Truth be told, it's likely because the war had been going on for so long, it was just an approximate date to make it more easier to understand for everybody. There's a few main features of the 100 Years' War that have defined and have changed the European continent. Obviously, the outcome of the 100 Years' War was the fact that the English lost all of their possessions on the mainland of Europe. Initially, when the war started, they only had the Gascon provinces, but after multiple battles and multiple kings having fought each other, the English at one point even managed to get half of France, even more than half, some would argue. And the sides involved the Burgundians, the Castilians, various Italians, Germans, etc., the Britons, and so on. Pretty much most of Europe had been on one side or the other of the 100 Years' War during its duration, with the Burgundians switching sides between the French and the English whenever it was more convenient for them. The 100 Years' War is also the very first time in which we see artillery play a major factor, cannons having been employed in the 100 Years' War, and by the French especially, they were used to maximum effectiveness. Towards the end of the war, the French managed to completely overtake the multiple English fortifications on the mainland, which led to the very speedy conquest of the entirety of the French region by the French. What we can expect in Europa Universalis 5 from the French and the English is, at the start, a very significant population, because for example the English had roughly around 6 million people in 1337, whilst the French had somewhere between 8 to 10 million, which is almost double. However, just a few years after the start date, one major event happened. Everybody knows by now, considering I've been mentioning it in every single EU5 video, the Black Death, which essentially was the most horrific plague that ever struck Europe. Some people don't know this, but the Black Death is actually the second time that this particular strain of plague hit the European continent. The first time it was when Justinian was around, and it was called the Justinian Plague. During the reign of Justinian, the advanced scouting party of the Black Plague, as we would call it, right, the Black Death, made its way to the Eastern Roman Empire and absolutely decimated the empire as consequence, leading to a massive decrease in population around. But it was actually contained to a certain degree, and it didn't reach the entirety of Europe, or it didn't have the same effect over the entirety of Europe as the Black Death had, which is the same likely strain affecting Europeans many hundreds of years later. That being said, the Black Death completely wiped out the population of France and England. Roughly 50% of the population died from it, which led to a complete collapse and recession in a lot of different fields, a massive setback for both kingdoms, which makes for a very interesting initial campaign, at least for me, and I'm sure a lot of you would really enjoy playing this out to see how the 100 Years' War is gonna go, considering you also have to deal with half your people dying off. That is something that is not going to affect the Yuan as much as it's gonna affect the Europeans, because the Black Death having reached Europe doesn't really make much of a difference in Asia, because remember, it originated in Asia. Most people in Asia already had some sort of immunity built up to the Black Death or whatever bubonic plague that was. However, Yuan at the 1337 start date is at its weakest. It lost pretty much most of the control it has over its country. There's tons of ravaging rebels and bandits around the countryside of Yuan, with the actual emperor holding limited amounts of authority. A few years after the start, they would lose their entire army in the failed invasion of Japan, which would lead to the complete collapse of Yuan and the withdrawal of Yuan to the northern bits, in forming northern Yuan as we know it historically. In 1337, however, However, they would have a lot of famines to be dealing with, which would cause some population to die off. Not as much of a percentage as it caused the Europeans, however. Yuan is likely going to be the case of the strongest nation with massive internal issues that you would have to face. I'm assuming that Paradox is going to give Yuan some sort of mechanics or some sort of decadence mechanics, better yet, as the Ottomans have in EU4, which you have to navigate through. Maybe some event chains and making the right decisions will play out in your favor, leading to you perhaps even not getting a complete collapse of society, or maybe you get the choice of playing off as the Ming, the nascent nation coming out of the carcass of the Yuan dynasty. Now that we got the obvious nations out of the way, let's talk about the really fun and interesting ones, such as the Mali Empire. Now, as you guys probably know if you're history buffs, 1337 is again a very special year for the Mali Empire, which reinforces the fact that Paradox chose this year for a lot of different reasons. Imperial Mali is at the height of its power in 1337. However, one thing happened in 1337 that will shape the future of Mali, whether for the good or for the bad. Namely, Mansa Musa, the famous richest person to have ever lived, although that is debatable by the way, stopped being the emperor of Mali, and his son Magan Keita took over the Mali Empire during the reign of Mansa Musa, or Mansa Keita, which was his actual name, Keita being the dynasty. Mali grew to be one of the richest, strongest nations in the area, and everybody knows about the tale of Mansa Musa going on to his pilgrimage to the Holy Lands. During his Hajj, he actually used up so much gold that some argued he took loans from Cairo's moneylenders in order to negate the debase that happened because of his gold spendings in Cairo at the time. Regardless, from various historical attempts, we do know that he had a 100 elephants train caravan, better yet, full of gold that he took with them on his Hajj, and he was ridiculously rich. Now, truth be told, we don't know the actual date of Mansa Musa's death. Depending on which historical references we're citing here, it could have been 1332, it could have been 1337, could have even been later, who's to say? Whatever the case, we do know that his son was the first, as they say, good for nothing, as I say. He essentially just spent away the fortunes of Mali. He didn't build anything, he didn't conquer anything. He essentially was just a 21st century gamer, as some would call him, except he didn't have a PlayStation. His uncle Musa's brother took over, Suleiman took over a few years later, however, and he put Mali back on track. The 1300s is actually when the Mali Empire shines. They would completely dominate West Africa for the entirety of this century, and I'm sure that EU5 is going to reflect that, and it will show how strong the Mali Empire is, as well as it will show the different paths it has, because remember, 1337 is possible that if you stay with Mansa Musa's son in charge, you might end up down a path not so amazing for your empire. Also take note, Mali, there are accounts of Mali having actually successfully reached the New World, one of Mansa Musa's ambitions. Who's to say? Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. There's no actual proof that they did, but there are some accounts that they did manage to reach the coast of Brazil as we know it today. We have that reflected in EU4, since EU4 does have a pretty significant colonial path for Mali, and I'm sure that we're gonna have one for Mali in EU5, whereas we might even be the very first colonial nation to reach the New World before the Europeans even know what hit them. Moving on to the eastern snowy plains of Europe, we have a very complicated situation, and one of the most interesting starts is, of course, the Muscovites. The Principality of Muscovy is significantly smaller in 1337, and unlike 1444, it's not a given that Muscovy is going to be the ultimate Eastern Slav lord. At this time, Novgorod, the Republic of Novgorod, was the big boy, but was not big enough to take on the hordes. Pretty much all the Russian principalities were paying tribute to the Golden Horde, which in our case is divided between the east and the western wing, and is depicted in this particular mod as the White Horde and the Blue Horde. I do suspect in 1337 for EU5, it's going to be one entity, the Golden Horde, and then it's going to have subdivisions within that particular entity. Whatever the case, the Muscovites are relatively small in 1337, and they will have a bit of a struggle to manage to grow in size and take over their neighbor Tatars, from a historical perspective, the reason Muscovy got to be the ultimate Russian state is because they were the ones chosen by the Golden Horde to pay their tribute. So Muscovy was in charge of taking the tribute from all the other Russian principalities, putting it into one big pile, and then taking it over to the Tatars. So what the Muscovites were slowly doing is they were not giving the Tatars all of the tribute that they were taking from their fellow Russians, and as such, the more tribute the Russians were paying to the Muscovites, the less the Muscovites were giving the Tatars, and the excess surplus that the Muscovites got, they used to fund their campaigns, grow in size, and eventually become massive to the point where they would eventually, in the 1471 if I'm not mistaken, they got their independence from the Tatars of the Golden Horde, and eventually wiped out the Tatars as we know historically. And since we are in this region, I also want to make a small addendum here for the Principality of Smolensk. Smolensk was ruled by the Rostislavich, which were descendants from the fallen Kievan Rus, which was wiped out by the Mongols' invasion. In 1337, Smolensk was actually at the precipice. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania was about to attack Smolensk, and what potentially could have been the actual ultimate Russian principality ended up getting schnappeldupe. That was because they took the wrong sides at different times in history. Instead of allying with the Muscovites, they fought against the Muscovites until they realized it's maybe not a bad idea to ally with them, and then they allied and they fought against Tver together. Whatever the case, historically speaking, Smolensk had a bright future, but they just fucked it up. So we might even see Smolensk being even more fun than Muscovy, but do remember Smolensk would still have to pay a hefty toll if it wants to get ahead of the curve. In the southern reaches of the Arabian Peninsula, the Rassilid dynasty of the Yemenites, or Yemenis, or whatever you want to call them, is in full bloom. It would take another 100 something years until the Rassilids are dethroned, and this is seen honestly as the golden era of Yemen. The Rassilids were a Sunni dynasty with origins that might be a little bit contested. If we listen to Sunni sources, they are from a Ghassanid family that managed to make its way into Yemen eventually. However, if you look at the Shia sources, they are of Oghuz Turkic origin, and if you look at pretty much any other third-party sources, they're also of a Oghuz Turkic origin, as were, for that fact, majority of the ruling dynasties of the period, since just a couple of hundred years earlier, the Turks were in charge of the Egyptian lands. Prior to the Ayyubids, they were in charge of most of the areas to the north of the Arabian Peninsula. Whatever the case, it doesn't matter, that's like hundreds of years prior. So in 1337, the Rassilids were in charge of Yemen, whatever you want to think of them, and they actually did a pretty good job. They managed to make Yemen flourish, mostly due to its slave trade, which might not be the best way to put it, but it was what it was. Yemen, alongside Oman, were deeply entrenched in slave trade in this particular time frame, as they were for the next 500 years for that matter. And due to that particular trade, and of course also to certain productions of certain goods, Yemen had a period of peace and prosperity that we only hope to see in the nearby future IRL for Yemen as well, hopefully. Yemen's going to be an especially good start in 1337 because since it has that high stability that I think is going to play a major role in EU5, it's going to have an easy time to expand into the Ethiopian lands, which are very much so divided at this time period between the Sunnis and the Coptic Orthodox Ethiopians, or Miaphysites as they're shown on the map now. They should be able to unify the loosely allianced tribal states in the central parts of Arabia, and due to their trade network, they can likely expand into India as well as the other eastern parts of the African continent. As we talked about India, of course, we're not going to leave the big elephant in the room because it is a Delhi elephant that we're talking about. That's right, you're probably wondering, why is Delhi so massive on the map in 1337? Well, Delhi Sultanate actually was extremely powerful in this time frame, but it is actually 1337 and afterwards that they start losing these lands. They should technically get an event or something to happen which lets them lose all of the Bahmani's lands in just a couple of years, and then that's going to follow it up with the more lands being lost in central India, Bengal also breaking away, and eventually Delhi being reduced to nothing. So I suspect that Delhi's going to have some similar disaster mechanics that Yuan's going to have, which is going to see it chopped to pieces. Maybe you're going to get the choice of either electing to dispose of certain regions and keep the other regions and centralize them, or you can try and keep all the regions and maybe have a significantly harder time to actually achieve that particular feat. Funnily enough, the Tughlukids of Delhi were also of Turkic origin. It's almost like the Turk owned the whole world at some point, isn't it? Take note, in 1336, 1 year prior to our start date, the Vijayanagars also got established as a breakaway Delhi state, well, breakaway from the Delhi Sultanate. They were, of course, a Hindu nation, and they were tired of the Delhi Muslims telling them what to do. Eventually, Vijayanagar went on to conquer most of South India, and I'm gonna make the addendum to Delhi being Vijayanagar, since I strongly suspect Vijayanagar is gonna be one of the most fun nations to play, in my opinion. It will be a challenging start in 1337, since they've basically just appeared on the map 1 year prior, but it's gonna be a very fun start for sure. Madurai also would have been one of the bigger nations that broke away from Delhi that contended with Vijayanagar in the time period. I believe it was in 1335 that Madurai broke away, so 1 year prior to Vijayanagar, and it was a Sunni state, so keep that in mind as well. Remember that pretty much nobody was Sunni except the dynasty itself. The ruling class was Sunni in South India, at least, well, in most of India for that matter. In this particular time frame, less than 1% of India was Muslim. If you're still not sure why they chose 1337, yet another major thing happened in 1336, 1 year prior to our start date. The Ashikaga shogunate was established after they managed to take down the emperor that had taken down the Kamamura shogun. Emperor Go-Daigo over here was simply a figurehead, with the shogun of Ashikaga being the one in charge of the country. Not sure why this mod doesn't depict it, because I think it was August 1336, if I'm not mistaken, 1 year prior, when Ashikaga managed to become the shogun. Emperor Go-Daigo managed to do the Kenmu restoration, which lasted between 1333 and 1336, and then after 1336, for the next 200 years, we have the Ashikaga shoguns in charge, which led to the Onin Wars, which saw the Tokugawa shogunate being established. So 1337 is essentially the start of Ashikaga's 200 years reign. A lot of interesting things are gonna happen. This was known as basically a quasi-military dictatorship for these 200 years, which eventually led to the Onin Wars. Pretty funny how we have so many massive historical events piled up in a very, very short time frame, all sometime around 1337. I never even thought about it, but there's a lot of awesome things going on around the world in this time frame. A little bit south of the Japanese islands, we also have the rising Majapahit Empire. This is the golden era of the Majapahit Empire, a Hindu/Buddhist nation in this particular time frame. Majapahit was by far the strongest in the Indonesian archipelago, and we have a lot of accounts about Majapahit from Ibn Battuta's travels, the famous one, of course. To the north, into the Sumatran bits, we do have the initial incursion of Delhi, one of the Sunni sultanates, as well as Pasai. Eventually, as we know, Islam took over the entirety of Indonesia, but it was not as clear that that would happen in 1337. Far from it, actually. Trading with the Muslim world was one of the main reasons why the Indonesian archipelago converted to Islam, because via trade, a lot of Islamic influence came over to this region. Initially through trade, but eventually a lot of missionaries came over and they started converting the lands to Islam. Ibn Battuta mentions that the women were basically equal to men prior to Islam arriving into Majapahit, with women being soldiers, riding on horses, doing work that men would do. So we have a complete societal change after Islam arrived to these lands. If they manage to portray Majapahit properly, I do expect Majapahit to be one of the strongest nations as well, not just an interesting start, because they would have the potential to discover Australia very easy on in the early part. They have the potential to colonize the rest of Indonesia. Obviously, the more eastern bits would not be as colonized or known, because it would be basically, you know, the good old cannibals of Papua and such. So we might expect some flavor around colonizing the eastern parts of Indonesia and even the Australian continent. We might even see the struggle between Hinduism, Buddhism, animism, and Islam. So we might see a little bit of a battle of the religions as the central theme of Majapahit whenever we play as them. Also, we might see a little bit of a theme between Sunda and Majapahit, Sunda being one of the main rivals of Majapahit and controlling the other half of the Javanese island. Historically, what the Majapahit did is they tried to royal marry their way into Sunda's lands. Sunda took that as an alliance offer, but Majapahit used the royal marriage as a casus belli to attack Sunda and take it over. In the process, the entirety of Sunda's royalty was slaughtered. So Majapahit was definitely not the good guys in that particular situation, if you know what I mean. The 1300s were also the period in which we saw the Venetian Republic flourish. The Venetians managed to grab massive swathes of land in the form of mostly islands and ports around the Mediterranean, with the more notable holdings being in Crete, for example, Euborea, and a lot of other smaller holdings in the Peloponnese, the islands around here as well. The Venetians were masters of trade in the Mediterranean via the trade that they did with the Byzantines. Essentially, the Silk Road trade would eventually end up in Constantinople, and from Constantinople there were some land routes, of course, but the majority of the trade was done via sea after the Ottomans took over Gallipoli, and they managed to block off and essentially blockade Constantinople, cut it off from the rest of its holdings, whatever holdings they might have had around the rest of the Greek lands, or better yet, Balkan Peninsula. In a way, the fall of the Byzantine Empire benefited the Venetians initially, but as time progressed, the Ottomans gained so much strength that they took over Constantinople, which essentially destroyed the most of the trade income of the Venetians, because the Ottomans were putting more and more restrictive trade measures on the Venetians, and even embargoes eventually. That would be hundreds of years for us in the future, so if you do start as the Venetians, you might have a little bit of expansion into Italy if you want to grab the northern bits above the island of Venice, but you also have the potential of just conquering the entirety of the Mediterranean, or all the islands, and be the island nation you always wanted to be. I mentioned this one in my previous video, but I want to reiterate how interesting the Danish start's going to be, because in 1337, technically Denmark did not exist. Due to some unforeseen circumstances, the king of Denmark was ousted, and Denmark was pawned. It essentially belonged to various Germanic counts. Scania was also sold off to the Swedes, and the Estonian holdings basically had some sort of independence, more or less, until the crown was reforged from the shards of Narsil. No, that's a different history book, my bad. More than anything, I'm just curious to see how Paradox is going to depict this, because we do know from the map that they showed in the dev diaries that we do have Denmark on the map. We just don't know who owns it or what exactly is going on there, you know? Could also just be placeholders. Maybe they're not going to put Denmark on the map, who's to say? Of course, this video would not be complete without the Ottomans. Everybody knows Ottomans are the big bad boy in 1444, but in 1337, the Ottomans were reduced to just a few fledgling cities. However, they were super strong. I'm talking about insanely powerful. They were led by Monsieur Orhan Osmanoglu, and Orhan was the one that managed to break away into the Balkans, took over vast chunks of the Byzantine lands, consolidated over the Anatolian Beyliks, took over Karasi, took over parts of the Beyliks that gave them the manpower needed in order to fight their wars. I do suspect that the Ottomans are going to start with some serious buffs that are going to allow them a huge, fast expansion, which is something that not all nations are going to be seeing in 1337. In fact, for our number one spot, who guesses? Who's the number one on the list? That's right, number one on the list is the Byzantines. Now, I did mention in the past that the Byzantines are going to be weak, even though they are significantly bigger than they are in 1444. However, and this is a big however, boyos, it's not as bad as it seems. I mean, sure, according to the map that we have already released, we can see over here that the city of Nicomedia itself was captured by the Ottomans, but not the entirety of the region was captured. So that means technically the start date is going to have the Ottomans at war with the Byzantines, a war in which the Byzantines likely are going to have a hard time winning. But this is not the war in which the Byzantines let the Ottomans cross on over to Europe. Far from it. That happened in 1354. That's almost 20 years until that would happen. And truth be told, the reason the Ottomans were actually able to take Gallipoli was because of an earthquake which destroyed the walls of Gallipoli. So they had a free-for-all, basically, meal buffet over there. A Swedish buffet, some would say, except it was Byzantine. And that's just how historical events played out, right? But in 1337, technically, the Byzantines were not that weak, but they were Byzantines. If we take a historical look at it, the reason the siege of Gallipoli happened in the first place was because the Byzantines Byzantines were in a civil war that started in 1352, which weakened the entirety of Byzantium and which allowed the Ottomans to take advantage of this weakness to sneakily take shit that they would not have had a single chance to take if the Byzantines were not at war again with each other. Holy shit, Romans, do I need to make a time machine, go back in time and tell you to stop fighting each other so you don't actually get schnappled by the Ottomans? What the hell, man? And you want to hear the sad part? You want to hear the sad part? That was not even the only civil war between 1337 and the fall of Gallipoli. There had been multiple. There was another civil war in 1341, just 4 years after the supposed start date of EU5, between the Cantacuzinos and the Palaiologos, and the next war again between the Cantacuzinos and the Palaiologos. Yeah. It's not about the amount of troops that the Byzantines are gonna have. I feel the biggest issue is gonna be the internal security of the Byzantine Empire in this particular time frame. In 1347, after the civil war of Cantacuzinos and Palaiologos, the first one, the Serbians managed to grab hold of Macedonia, Albania, Epirus. They established the Serbian Empire, all because the Byzantines were too busy fighting each other instead of actually doing something and defending their territories. So, Civil War 1, the Serbians get the shit. Civil War 2, the Ottomans get the shit. Who's the winner of a Roman Civil War? Not the Romans, that's for sure. In the 1300s alone, the Byzantines had 5 civil wars, dude. 5 civil wars. What the hell were they thinking? Suffice to say, I do think this is going to be the most fun and most interesting start in 1337. I don't know how Paradox plans on depicting the Byzantines, what kind of armies they're going to have, what kind of strength they're going to have. I've done a little bit of historical research and I've gone back and I've read some of my old resources, some of my old books and so on. And I think roughly the Byzantine Empire should have around the same amount of soldiers that the Ottomans would have at the start. Because remember, the Ottomans were getting ready for their massive expansion. The Byzantines were already a pretty significant state. However, the Byzantines were paying significantly more for their units than the Ottomans because the Ottomans were fueled by zealotry and by the passion for expansion and the loot that they were about to get from expanding, right? Whilst the Byzantines were paying premium to keep people loyal. Loyalty was in short supply in the Byzantine Empire. That is for sure. I really hope you guys enjoyed this video. I want to make more videos like these, and I've got a really cool history video coming up, dedicated history video coming up on 1337. So don't forget to subscribe. We really want to get that 200,000 if possible by the end of this month, so we do the mega campaign as consequence. And until the next time, check out this awesome video up next. And I want to give a massive thank you to all of my patrons, channel members, and Twitch subscribers. I would not be able to do this without all your support.